Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and welcome to the channel. Hey LS guys, who wants to see an intake shootout between a factory truck manifold and the Holley mid-rise and Holley high ram? Now we think that the Holley stuff is definitely going to make more power, but what's the difference in power between the mid-rise and the high ram? In this video, we're going to compare the factory truck intake manifold to the Holley mid-rise intake manifold to the Holley high ram manifold, and not just on one motor. We're going to compare it on a 6-liter motor, a modified one at that, and also a 383, also modified. And just to throw it in at the end there, I'm going to compare the 383 to the 6-liter because I know you guys want it.
To getting started on our Holley manifold shootout, comparing the high ram to the mid-rise to the factory truck manifold, we're going to take a look at two different combinations. And our first combination is actually a 6-liter LS. This was the motor that we used for when we compared all of the basic cathedral port intake manifolds, and that video is up, so if you haven't taken a look at it, make sure you check it out. Anything that you want to know basically about almost any of the manifolds that were available at the time for the cathedral port LS applications were tested on this 6-liter, so you can compare basically anything that you want. But this is an interesting comparison. This is the first of the two that we're going to compare these same manifolds on. We'll run them on a 6-liter and then also on a 5.3-liter 383 stroker. So our 6-liter was a modified version made so that we can, it had enough power to really tax the manifolds, because if you run it on a stock motor, testing intake manifolds really isn't going to show you what they're capable of, because the motor is holding back what the manifold can do rather than the other way around. So this 6-liter was a healthy modified 6-liter. It was a 6-liter truck block, originally an LQ4. It had a stock crank, which is more than strong enough for what we were doing for the RPM range and the power output. In fact, as we've seen, these stock cranks are good enough for 1,500 horsepower or more. But we did upgrade the pistons and the rods. Our rods were from Carrillo, and our pistons were CP from Flat Tops. These were both their Bullet series stuff. So plenty strong enough for what we were doing again. And if we wanted to add a ton of boost to this combination, we certainly could, because the stock block, stock crank, and the forged rods and forged pistons will make a lot of power. We also naturally needed a good camshaft in our 6-liter to help show what these manifolds would do. So we installed the Comp 469 cam, which was a 617/624 lift, a 231/247 degree duration split, and 113 degree lobe separation angle. In this instance, we actually used limited travel lifters, and so we had to adjust our push rod length to get the preload just right. Topping that off, we need a good set of heads for all of this. Obviously, again, we're not going to tax the manifold out if we have a stock set of heads on there. So we used a set of Airflow Research LSX V2 230 heads. So they had more than enough flow potential and a lot of good mid-lift flow and everything. They make good power. They also had 58 cc chambers, which helped bring our static compression up. This thing was run with a set of 1 7/8" long tube headers, and we did have collector extensions and mufflers, but the mufflers have no effect on power basically, other than lengthening the collector extension. We had a Amoroso oil pan on this thing, I think. Oh, no, I take that back. We had a truck pan. We had the Mazir electric water pump. We ran all of this with a Holley HP management system. We had 75-pound injectors. And then we ran this with our 3 different intake manifolds. The first one being the factory early truck manifold, one with the 3-volt 78 or 80 millimeter throttle body. We ran an AccuFab, but you could just as easily run the stock one from the early pre-drive-by-wire stuff. We had as I said, we had the right push rod length, and then we dialed in the air, fuel, and timing as we always do until it didn't make any power. And in this case, it ended up being about 29 degrees of total timing, and that's where this thing made best power. And it would repeat run after run. We tried adjusting the air fuel. We start out rich, and then we lean it out until it makes as much power as it's going to, and then it will stop making power, no matter how lean we get it. So that's our point. Those are the points we pick for the timing and air fuel. So run with our truck intake manifold, the early truck manifold, on our modified 6-liter. This combination produced right near 550 horsepower, 549.3. And peak torque checked in at 481 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we installed the first of our Holley manifolds. This was the Holley mid-rise manifold. So as you can see, it actually made slightly less power than the factory truck manifold through most of the curve, all the way out to 6,100 RPM, and then it started making more power than the truck manifold. The truck manifold is designed for torque production, and it does very well in this range, up to 6,000 or so, even this early one. A Trailblazer SS is even better than the truck manifold, so you can make even more power with another factory choice. But it's important to note on the mid-rise, it is basically has a number of different configurations. So you can run it as a dual 4-barrel manifold. You can run it as a EFI dual 4-barrel manifold with two 4150 4-hole throttle bodies. For our configuration, we ran it as a single inlet throttle body EFI. So we had the 4-hole or the dual 4-hole, the dual quad manifold, and then we had another intermediate manifold section that converts the dual quad section basically to a common plenum. And then you have the lid, the same lid that you would use on a high ram or this mid ram. In this particular case, the lid for it was equipped to accept a 92 millimeter throttle body, and that's what we ran on this. So we ran a single throttle body on our mid-rise, and that ended up on our 6-liter producing 566 horsepower. Peak torque was down a little bit compared to the truck at 469 horsepower. And here's what happened when we ran the final of our two Holley manifolds, including the factory truck one. This was a high ram. Equipped with a high ram, we were almost near 600, 596 horsepower. Peak torque was out at 473 foot-pounds, but at a much higher RPM. Peak torque happened out past 63 or 6,400 RPM. So it did very well, although it was fairly flat. It was still making 472 foot-pounds down around 5,100. So it had the typical kind of LS torque plateau, we like to call it. So nearly 600 horsepower. And as you can see, the crossover point for the high ram was at 5,900. The stock truck manifold made more than the high ram all the way up to 5,900. And then the high ram kind of took off. So on these high RPM applications, even on a 6-liter, you have to be running some fairly high RPM for the Holley manifold to be better than the truck, or certainly, and also the Trailblazer SS. But if you compare the high ram to the mid-rise, the high ram was better from 4,700 RPM on out compared to the mid-rise. And below that, they were trading 1 or 2 horsepower maybe. So essentially, they were the same from 2,900 all the way out to there. So if you're picking a manifold and you've got room for it, the high ram is kind of a good way to go if you want to run lots of high RPM power. And this is what happens. I get a lot of questions on guys wanting to know, well, what does the mid-rise do? Is it in between those two? And now you can see. Let's get to our next motor. So not only do we run this configuration, the stock manifold and the mid-rise and the high ram on the 6-liter, we also ran it on a 383. This particular 383 was a bored and stroked 5.3-liter. It had a 3904, a 3905 bore, and a 4-inch stroke. It had JE small dish pistons, 10 cc, so the compression is going to be lower on this motor than it was on the 6-liter. It had scat forged rod 6125s. It had a slightly different camshaft in it. This one was from Crane. It was 600 lift both on the intake and the exhaust, a 232, 240 degree duration, and 115 degree lobe separation angle. This one also had different heads on it. It had trick flow, or TEA, I should say, total engine airflow, CNC ported 5.3 meter, the 706 heads. These are their stage 2 heads. So these were very good heads also. 1 3/4 headers with mufflers. These were the QTP headers, I believe. Had 36-pound injectors. Holley HP management system, obviously dialed in the same way that the 6-liter was. And we started off with the stock truck intake manifold and the AccuFab 78 to 80-ish millimeter throttle body. Equipped as such with the stock truck manifold, the 383 produced 540 horsepower and 518 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we installed the mid-rise. Similar thing to the 6-liter. It made less power down low and a little more on the top. Let's see here. And on this instance, instead of the lid on the Holley mid-rise manifold, running it with a 92 millimeter throttle body. We put the lid on it from the high ram that had the 102 or 105 millimeter throttle body. In this case, we ran a 102 millimeter fast throttle body on it. And it produced a peak of 543 horsepower. So not a lot more peak horsepower, but peak torque was down a bit, 499 foot-pounds of torque, just right under 500 foot-pounds of torque. And here's what happened when we installed the high ram on our 383. Similar thing to the 6-liter, it made a lot more peak power as it tends to. It made 561 horsepower. And peak torque checked in at 505 foot-pounds of torque. So peak torque on both of those were less than it was on the truck manifold. But peak power is obviously up. The crossover point with the Holley, it made more power than the truck manifold from about 57 or 5800 RPM. So again, if you're wanting to make peak power out farther in the RPM range, these Holley manifolds actually work fairly well, which is why a lot of guys use them on race cars and on turbo cars. And again, the same thing happens under boost, is they're going to make the same kind of a difference in power curve. Everything's just going to be elevated with boost, so the manifolds will react the same way. So a high ram is a really good kind of high RPM manifold, and that's why guys choose it a lot for running under boost. If you're running from 5500 to 7500, it's going to be a good combination. But here's what it did on the 383. So now let's kind of compare maybe the 383, because I know guys are going to want to see it. They want to compare the 383 to the 6-liter, and we'll find out what happens even though they're different configurations.
So now that we've taken a look at the difference between the stock manifolds and the two Holley manifolds, both on the 6-liter and on the 383, we can do a quick comparison of the 6-liter and 383. Again, even though they weren't run with the same combination of parts, but everybody's going to want to know, well, how do those things compare? So this is our 383 with the stock intake manifold on there. And here is our 6-liter with the stock manifold on there. And the stock manifold on the 6-liter actually made a little bit more power. It made 549 versus 542. The 383 made more torque, 518 compared to 481. So not surprising, the bigger motor would make more torque and makes more power all the way out to 6100 RPM. So this is kind of what strokers do. It had good heads, although I would suspect that the airflow heads probably would be a little bit better maybe than the ported 706 heads. The 6-liter had more compression, it had a flat top piston, and it had a small chamber. So it had a lot going for it in terms of the one thing that it didn't have was it didn't have the displacement that the 383 has. But let's take a look and see how they compare with two other manifolds. So we'll take a look at the high rams, and we'll compare high ram to high ram, and then we'll get rid of our stock manifolds. So this is the high ram with a 6-liter compared to the high ram with a 383, and we see a similar thing that we saw with the stock manifolds. The 383 makes more power, up to 6100 with the high ram. It makes more peak torque. It's got 505 foot-pounds versus 474 foot-pounds with the 6-liter. The 6-liter made more peak power, 596 horsepower versus 561 horsepower with the 383. Again, you know, different compression, different heads, different camshafts. But this kind of gives you an idea, if I know that guys wanted to see this, in displacement adds power. If you can feed it with, like if we were to take if we had the flat top piston in the 383 and then we had the airflow research head on the 383, obviously this would be a little bit different comparison. The 383 would actually have more compression because it has more displacement with the same combination of chamber size and piston design. But thought you guys might want to see this, so here is the 383 versus the 6-liter. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay guys, what do we learn from this little adventure comparing the factory truck intake manifold to the Holley mid-rise and Holley high ram? Here's the takeaway. Intake manifolds are RPM specific. Both the high ram and the mid-rise are designed to produce power at a much higher engine speed than the factory truck manifold. And we saw that both on the 6-liter and on the 383. So when you're picking your intake manifold, choose wisely. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. I'll keep testing.